Hi there. Welcome, everyone. So, my name is Karen Kennedy, and I'm the author of the newly published book, Hack Your Blood Sugar. And I'm coming on here because I wanted to announce the book and talk to you and see if anybody's read it. But primarily, I want to talk about one topic in particular. So, you guys might have questions. And I want to talk a little bit about diabetes and glucotypes. So, I don't know if you are somebody who's had diabetes, if you have diabetes now, but there's this term, and I'm going to do a screen share here. There's this term that kind of drives me nuts, and we call it living with diabetes. And this is something I hear clinically. People will do talks on this, living with diabetes. And I always like to change these phrases because I often see people think, oh, I'm just living with diabetes, as if it's something they have to accept that it's inevitable and they don't have any control over. And with some people, that might be the case, but more often than not, you have more leverage than you think. And I'm going to skip some of this. When I meet someone for the first time who has diabetes, this is what I see. Living with diabetes looks like this. It means you're on some medication that improves your blood sugar for a period of time. But after a year or two on that medication, you need another medication. And after a year or two on that, you need another medication. And it creates this sense of total helplessness. Like you don't know how to shift it, because the standard treatment for diabetes tends to be this, unless you feel like you have to do a total life overhaul. So I'd be curious if anyone in the chat is experiencing something like this. And I'll say that this is not because your doctor thinks the best way to improve things is with medication and another medication, another medication. It's very likely your doctor thinks that they would love it if you would do some lifestyle modifications. They would love to be able to help you with this, but they literally have 10 or 15 minutes with you, and they're not certain that and they don't have the tools to show you what to do. But here's the thing that's really interesting to me, is that some people have one kind of diabetes, and I'm not talking type 1 diabetes. When I'm talking about diabetes, from my perspective, I'm always talking about type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. I know a lot of the people watching this account might have type 1 diabetes, and some of this information could apply to them, but type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes are very different things. And I don't generally talk about type 1 diabetes. That's my expertise. What I do is I'm a functional nutritionist, and I support people with type 2 diabetes and prediabetes reverse those. And the way I like to approach this, as you've seen in my book, Hack Your Blood Sugar, is the first step in that is to try to figure out what kind of diabetes you have, what kind of prediabetes you have. Because type 2 and prediabetes are what we call heterogeneous conditions. And by that I mean that if you get three people who all have the same A1C, like an A1C of 6.2. So A1C is the measurement that gives you your average blood sugar over 3 months. It estimates your average blood sugar over the past 3 months. So let's say you have 3 different people and their A1C is 6.2. They all have 3 different things going on. They all have very different glucose and insulin profiles. And the strategy to improve that and bring their blood sugar, their A1C, back down under 5.7 could all be different. It could all be different. One of them, it could be because they have beta cell dysfunction. One of them could have insulin resistance. One could have insulin resistance because of poor sleep. One could have it because of inflammation, and a completely other person could have a different cause. And if you're like me and you're a provider and you pay attention to these things, you know that if someone has a different cause of their disease, they probably have there's a different solution to it. There's a different treatment, a different approach. So I find it's very helpful to examine and understand the root cause of your diabetes, of your prediabetes, because once you understand the cause, then you're a lot closer to figuring out what the solution is. So rather than a total lifestyle change, and some people do need a total lifestyle change, we want to figure out what is the most effective strategy. If you could only do one or two things, because face it, most people are busy, most people don't have the capacity to take on a lot of changes at one time. We want to identify your root causes and then address those first. As I like to talk about in the book, when you identify the root cause of your problems and apply yourself to addressing those specifically, you get a better ROI, a better return on investment. It's kind of like someone who's in business. If they want to analyze their business and improve their profit margin, they're going to go through and say, okay, where are most of our profits coming from? Where are we getting the most profit from of all these products? And they find out that 80% of our profits are coming from these two products together. And these other 5, we're not making much money off of those. And so a smart business person would double down on those 2 products that they get 80% of their profit from. And they're going to put all their energy into that. So that's the kind of thing we're going to do with this, is we're going to find out what things are making the biggest impact on our health negatively. And then we're going to figure out what are the strategies that are going to improve that the most and not waste our time on the things that don't matter. So when I talk about different contributors to poor blood sugar control, there's a lot of different things that can raise your blood sugar and cause insulin resistance. And if you don't know what those 2 things are, I'm going to talk about them a little bit later. When I'm working with a patient, when I'm working with a group, we track a lot of different metrics to figure out why you have high blood sugar, why you have prediabetes, why you have type 2 diabetes. We are looking at inflammation markers, things like C-reactive protein, sedimentation rate, ferritin levels. We're looking at your sleep, maybe a sleep study, or we're tracking your sleep using a wearable. We look at HRV, or heart rate variability, which is a metric that looks at your stress levels. We might be looking at cortisol levels, insulin levels, triglycerides, your waist, VAT, which stands for visceral adipose tissue. We are using CGM data, continuous glucose monitor data. We look at your A1C, we look at fasting glucose, and we look at your blood pressure. We look at all these things, but as we move forwards and figure out what a specific type of diabetes or prediabetes a person has, we're going to narrow this down. Unfortunately, when you go to your annual doctor's appointment, and I hope you have an annual doctor's appointment because some people don't even have that, you're going to look at the following 3 metrics: your triglycerides, your A1C, and fasting glucose. And usually when it comes to your blood sugar, the only 2 metrics they'll take into account is your A1C, your hemoglobin A1C, and fasting glucose. That's it. You are probably not regularly checking inflammation markers, tracking or testing your sleep, your heart rate variability, your cortisol levels, your insulin. You're not tracking those other things, just those 3. So we're not looking at all the root causes of blood sugar, and which is why everybody gets lumped into a one-size-fits-all package of this is what you have to do to improve your blood sugar, usually the same medication that everybody else gets with the high A1C, and you get on the same track as everybody. Sometimes it works for people and sometimes it doesn't. Now this image is in the book, this diabetes iceberg. And I did this to show that A1C, while it's a helpful marker to track every year, I definitely wouldn't throw it out. It's a blunt instrument and it's not helping us. It's not helping the people who are, sorry, oh my gosh, we just got a hailstorm. This A1C is not the only marker we should be looking at every year. And I'll show you why. Down here at the bottom of the iceberg, where it says insulin resistance, you'll have a normal A1C. Normal meaning it's going to be below 5.7. It's not going to raise any red flags for anybody. You might be getting a belly. You might notice that you're getting more of a belly these days. You're not prioritizing sleep, higher stress. You're not exercising. Maybe you have a poor diet. But, in terms of your A1C and fasting blood sugar, everything looks fine. And your doctor would say, nothing wrong here. Blood sugar looks fine. But the thing is you could have all this going on and you have insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is your ability to utilize that glucose and insulin and get your glucose into your cells. I'll go into that a little more later. So you're developing insulin resistance, but nobody's testing. There's no metrics being regularly tested for this. So you get to progress. And then maybe you'll progress to a pre-diabetes diagnosis. And pre-diabetes, I will say, is not pre-anything. You get this diagnosis when your A1C pops up above 5.7, the magic cutoff. When you have this, most people, depending on the type of prediabetes you have, because there's different kinds, you'll likely have elevated fasting insulin, elevated triglycerides above 100, increased VAT, which is the visceral adipose tissue, the deep abdominal fat, and you might not have slightly increased blood pressure, but that's creeping up. So all these things are creeping up, and now you're labeled with prediabetes, which might trigger some action, and you might just decide, well, I don't have diabetes yet, there's nothing to be done. And in the conventional medical system, it doesn't qualify you for very much. Your doctor might at that point recommend you go on metformin. Why don't you go on metformin? And you might say, well, I don't know if I want to take metformin. Could I just try to reduce my blood sugar? And they'll say, yeah, take 3 months. And if it doesn't work, then we'll try metformin. And there's nothing wrong with medication. But what do you try? How do you get your blood sugar down? Some people can be very lucky or very strategic and do some things that bring their blood sugar down. And in 3 months, their A1C might get down to 5.5. And their doctor says, great, we don't need metformin. But do you know what worked? Can you keep it up? That's the big question. But most people, I would say, end up going on metformin. If they're being responsible, they take the medication. It drops their A1C down a little bit. But you know what it doesn't do? It doesn't lower their triglycerides. It doesn't lower their fasting insulin. It doesn't lower their visceral adipose tissue or their blood pressure. Metformin doesn't do that. It will keep the blood sugar lower because these systems are very glucose-centric. They're only looking at glucose. But the causes for your higher glucose are still there. It's insulin resistance. And that could go on for a long time, and you might never hit type 2 diabetes. But this pre-diabetes situation, if this keeps cooking underneath the surface, this leads to higher rates of heart disease, higher rates of cancer, higher rates of Alzheimer's disease. You will gain weight, you will have inflammation, you will have brain fog, and you won't feel good. But some of you will advance to type 2 diabetes, and you will layer on more medications as you go. So I would argue that we need to get in and address this stuff down at the bottom. When we see, the getting the belly, not sleeping as much, higher stress, this is where we need to get it. We could even start addressing it when it's at the pre-diabetes stage and reverse it, because pre-diabetes is reversible. And, type 2 diabetes can be reversible too. We can get that down into the pre-diabetes range. And that has a huge impact on improving your health and reducing your risk of heart disease. But I wish more people were catching this down here. Now, I've used the term insulin a few times. And if you don't know what insulin is the hormone that brings your glucose levels down. It's produced by the pancreas. And every time you eat and you get glucose levels rising in the bloodstream, insulin pops up and stores it away. High levels of insulin are driving a lot of our symptoms and are driving our metabolic dysfunction. But we don't measure it. We should measure it. It's literally an $8 lab. That's how much it costs me when I order this lab for people. Cash, no insurance. But it doesn't get measured regularly. Let me show you how insulin works, because this is really interesting and explains a little bit about insulin resistance. So if you can think of glucose, these blue things, floating around in the bloodstream after you have a meal, we need to get glucose into the cells. Glucose is, how we make energy. It's a fuel for our cells. So we want to go from glucose in the bloodstream to glucose in our cells, our fat cells, our muscle cells, all the cells. But when it comes to getting it into our fat and muscle cells, glucose can't just enter the cell by itself. It sort of needs an escort. It needs a key to get in. And insulin is that key. So when we have a lot of glucose floating around after a meal, the insulin gets secreted by the pancreas. It unlocks these doors and then glucose gets in. That's what insulin does. So your body likes to maintain your glucose levels at in a really a Goldilocks zone, a narrow range. And once your glucose levels get too high after a meal, insulin's job is just to skim off that excess and store it in your fat or muscle cells or liver cells for later between meals. And so that's what insulin does. Insulin just mops it up and stores it away for later. And so later, when you're hungry and your glucose levels start to drop, then glucose can get released and you have some energy for later. But here's what happens. Sometimes we get insulin resistant. And we get insulin resistant often by eating too much glucose. We eat maybe a very high sugar diet. But there's other ways we get insulin resistant, like not sleeping well or high stress or some of our medications. But the fact is when we're insulin resistant, it's as if there are fewer doors on this cell. I'm going to go back a slide. You see here, there's 3 doors, 3 places where insulin can open the door and let the glucose in. When there's insulin resistance, that cell has fewer doors on its surface. So that's like fewer receptors. And those receptors aren't willing to open. And it's usually because that fat or muscle cell is full. It doesn't want any more. It says, we're good. We don't want any more glucose. Go somewhere else. But the body needs to get rid of that glucose. It needs to store it away somewhere. And so your pancreas is still going to keep secreting insulin, and it's going to secrete more and more insulin until it gets that glucose in. It's just that basically it's just banging on the door, stuffing more into that full suitcase. So this is insulin resistance, and what it results in is a higher level of insulin. You have more insulin floating around. So in the early days, you might have your glucose levels might look fine. Your fasting glucose, your A1C, I said, that looks okay. You're still at the bottom part of the iceberg. But what you can't see are these rising levels of insulin in your bloodstream. And while insulin, you could say its main job, its number one job, is to regulate our glucose levels, to store away that excess glucose, preventing that diabetes, that high blood sugar. But high insulin, that chronically high insulin from having this insulin resistance, it does a few other things that you might want to know. It stores fat in the viscera, that's the VAT, visceral adipose tissue, which leads to fatty liver and you're really getting a belly. It increases inflammation. That visceral adipose tissue actually acts like an organ secreting cytokines that cause more inflammation. So high insulin leads to more inflammation, which for you means more pain and brain fog, that horrible brain fog where you just can't focus. High insulin drives up your blood pressure, right? So often we've been told if you have high blood pressure, you need a low salt diet. And I'm not saying keep eating a really high salt diet, but for a lot of people these days, it's more about their blood sugar and high insulin levels driving up their blood pressure. High insulin also increases your cravings, right? And it increases your cravings and it drops your energy. It also increases your risk for heart disease, cancer, erectile dysfunction, and dementia. These are all things that are on the rise. These are all things we want to avoid. And high insulin is behind all of them. But here's something that might interest you. Elevated insulin, this chronically high levels of insulin, acts as a fat storage hormone. So we saw earlier how insulin is a key to let glucose into a cell. So that's how we store energy. And usually we store energy as fat. Well, what's interesting is as long as that insulin level is high, that's telling the body store fat, store energy. And in between meals and when you're asleep, when you haven't eaten for a period of time, that allows your insulin levels to naturally drop down. And when your insulin levels are down, this should allow you to use some of that energy, pull it out and put it back in the circulation, where we might call that burning fat. So you can burn fat when your insulin levels are down. The problem is when you eat in such a way or you have insulin resistance, it's leaving your insulin levels high all day long and even well into the night. I've tested people with a fasting insulin levels of 30 when it should be closer to 5. and it's 30 first thing in the morning. So even after a whole night of fasting from maybe 10 p.m. until 7 a.m., their insulin levels are still so high that there's no way they're going to be burning fat. So this is a very complicated slide. This is in the book with a better explanation. But as long as you have this chronically high insulin, you are storing fat. So this is another reason that we need to get a handle on this blood sugar and insulin thing is for many people, you're just having a really hard time losing this excess weight, and especially the weight that's in the belly, in the visceral adipose tissue. Now, there's an actual name for this. I'm not making this up. There's a syndrome called metabolic syndrome, and the key factors of metabolic syndrome are things like visceral adipose tissue, elevated fasting glucose, slightly elevated fasting glucose, high blood pressure, low HDL cholesterol, and high triglycerides. So these are some labs that almost everybody gets, the HDL and the high triglycerides. You'll get them on your standard lipid panel, which your insurance covers. You also get that fasting glucose. These people get fatigue and brain fog. Some of them, when it's more advanced, will get a brown, like a dark coloration on their skin, around their neck and armpits. They will get fatty liver. You might notice oftentimes, and this isn't part of the description of metabolic syndrome, but you might see elevated uric acid in these people as well. So the important thing to remember here is that high insulin and insulin resistance drives a host of negative health outcomes, and we don't test for it. We don't test for it at all routinely. We test A1C, which is your average blood sugar levels over 3 months, and a spot check for fasting glucose. And that is not enough to catch this metabolic syndrome. And this metabolic syndrome is so common right now. I would say that, I wish I had the statistics on the top of my head, but I would say it's probably close to 50% of the US population. It's big. So you might be wondering, how do we track insulin? There's 3 different ways that I can look in this, and I'm going to put it all in a handout that I'll drop in here at the end. One is you can test a fasting insulin level. Yeah, you can order the lab. Like I said, it's a very inexpensive lab, about $8. And we want that under 7. Usually between 3 and 7 is where we like to have that fasting insulin. But unfortunately, this isn't something your doctor's going to order. Your insurance won't cover it. When I order it and we just pay cash for it, it's $8. So you can ask for that to be done. But there's 2 other things that you will get. One is your triglycerides, and this is abbreviated TG, and it's always included on your standard lipid panel, and your insurance is going to cover a standard lipid panel if you're fortunate enough to have insurance. But you can also look at your waist circumference. For men, we want it under 40, and women, we want it under 35 inches. And a lot of studies have shown that there's a high correlation between an elevated waist circumference above these measurements and high insulin levels. So often, if I don't have a fasting insulin level for a patient, but I do have triglycerides, and I see their triglycerides might be 120, and if it's a man, if their waist is 50 inches, I'm already thinking, probably have some insulin resistance here. Let's look at some other things. So these are the ways we can track insulin in a very budget-friendly way, in a way that we don't have to order more expensive labs. It just allows us to look at our health through a slightly different lens. And if you keep your glucose lower and track the metrics of high insulin so you can see them going down, your health will start to improve. Because if you keep glucose lower, it will help lower your insulin levels too. And if your insulin levels come down, your blood pressure will come down, you will reduce that visceral adipose tissue, your inflammation will come down, and your risk of cardiovascular disease will come down. You will feel better and you will look better naked. How do we track glucose? Well, right now, as I said, the only ways we track glucose is our hemoglobin A1C, which is a 3-month average, and a fasting glucose. And these just aren't enough to give us a picture of how our food and stress and sleep and everything is impacting our blood sugar over time. There it is, the A1C and the fasting glucose. I recommend people use a continuous glucose monitor. A continuous glucose monitor, or CGM, gives a more thorough picture and speeds up reversal of type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. It speeds it up. And you might be thinking, well, how can a sensor actually speed it up? First of all, I want to show you a couple of studies that have come out to show you why it's so important to reverse your type 2 diabetes, or at least take your type 2 diabetes and put it down into prediabetes. People who do this have a 40% lower risk of heart disease when they take their type 2 diabetes down at least to the prediabetes range. A 40% lower risk of heart disease. And prediabetes, if you can go from prediabetes to none of the above, you have a 50% lower risk of heart disease. So these are important things to do. And I want to show you how potentially easy this could be. So I want to show you some data from a few different people who I've worked with in the past, because I find this to be incredibly inspiring. And I hope if you have type 2 diabetes or a loved one of yours has type 2 diabetes, you will see this and go, oh, I didn't realize it could be this easy. So I'm going to show you Dawn. And first of all, what I'm showing you here, this data, what you're looking at is continuous glucose monitor data. So these continuous glucose monitors, they're the little sensors that you'll see on the back of people's arms. They're Dexcom G7s, Freestyle Libres, the Dexcom Stellos, and the Abbott Lingos. And let me tell you about Dawn. So Dawn is a 65-year-old man with type 2 diabetes. And I didn't even work with Dawn one-on-one. Dawn was a fellow that I worked with through a group program, right? He and his wife did a 4-week program with me. So that's just a 4-week group program. And I want to emphasize that because this is stuff that doesn't take months and months and months of training. This is not rocket science. This is stuff that you can learn to do on your own, maybe with a little support from your providers. So about Don, he does have type 2 diabetes. He was not taking insulin, but he was on 2 different diabetes medications to help lower his blood sugar. And at the beginning of the class, you can see, if you've not looked at continuous glucose monitor, I want you to maybe look at this middle one here. The x-axis, this is time. You can see the numbers here, midnight, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 6 a.m. So this is from midnight to midnight on a given day. And the y-axis, these are his blood sugar levels. And you can see this gray box I've marked off, and this is our Goldilocks zone. In the gray box between 70 and 140 milligrams per deciliter, that's the concentration of glucose we want to keep at. So that's the goal. We want to stay in that box as much as possible. But you can see Don, his first few days of doing this program, not only did he not stay in the Goldilocks zone most of the time, he barely got down into the Goldilocks zone. See up here all night long, you can see from midnight to 6 a.m., never in the Goldilocks zone, above it. And then it went even higher after he woke up. And then it finally came down middle of the day, and then it went up again, but staying in the Goldilocks zone was just impossible. And this made him very frustrated because he was in the class with some people with prediabetes and was feeling like, everybody else is staying in the Goldilocks zone easier than I can. But here's what he noticed after using a continuous glucose monitor for this week, because in the first week I told people, just eat as you normally would. Don't change anything. Just log what you're doing so we can collect some data. And this is what he noticed. He noticed that, and he used the term bready. Bready things were the hardest on his blood sugar. And so when I said, what's the first thing you want to try in terms of really getting your blood sugar dialed in? He said he was going to cut out the bready things, bread, muffins, cakes, and rolls, which might sound obvious to you, but he did that. And he started his meals with some more protein and vegetables. So instead of just having kind of a high carb meal, he made sure he was having some protein and some non-starchy vegetables. And if you've read the book, Hack Your Blood Sugar, at the end of this, we have something called the Metabolic Healthy Plate. And so this is what he's starting to follow, is the Metabolic Healthy Plate. But it wasn't a big shift. He still was eating a lot of the same foods. But this is what it looked like 2 weeks later. And this is what I want to point out. Look at his blood sugar overnight. It's about 80 85 overnight. This is the same. This looks like someone who doesn't even have diabetes. Granted, he's still on 2 medications. And there's a meal that he had here, and it went up in the morning, but it almost stayed in the target range, came back down. Look how good this data was. He was almost 100% in range 2 weeks later. And this is someone who has type 2 diabetes, who's on medication. And so this is what happened. In 4 weeks of this group program, he was already losing weight. He dropped 2 inches from his waist. And I said, how does this feel? Does this feel like a big ask? And he said, no, the changes really aren't that hard. He felt pretty good. And then I checked in 3 months later with him. He was still losing weight. His doctor had taken off 1 medication. So he's down a medication. And his doctor said, we're not going to do A1C anymore. We're just going to monitor using the CGM. That seems to be a good one. So far from living with diabetes, this guy is now reversing his diabetes, and that's 3 months. This is 3 months. And it's not this easy with everybody, but it's surprising how big of a difference you can make once you have this information, getting this real-time feedback. So let me show you a second person. This is another fellow with type 2 diabetes, 61 years old. Now, he had some neuropathy, that real pain in his feet. He was overweight. Both his parents had had amputations from diabetes, which is a common thing with people living with diabetes who aren't addressing the root causes, unfortunately. He exercises. He's got a good diet, meaning he eats a lot of vegetables and reasonably whole foods, but his blood sugar wasn't budging. And his doctor basically said, your next step is injectables, meaning at that time, insulin. And you can see his data. The first 3 days he was using a CGM. This is day 1. And see how high it is overnight, similar to the last guy. High during the day, barely gets in there. Same thing the second day. But let me show you what happened. And you can see already on the 3rd day, look, it's looking pretty good overnight now. Do you see this one? He goes to bed and it's low. What happened here is he started watching some of our videos. So he had signed up to work with me. And I said, start using your CGM. Don't change anything, which he completely ignored because he did it for a day or 2. And he says, that's enough of that. And he listened to one of my videos about how to bring your overnight blood sugar down. And he tried that tip, and lo and behold, it worked for him. And this is day 3, low overnight, high again during the day, but again, low at night. So compared to the first day, so this is 3 days, almost 100% above range. And then 2 days later, he's out of range. What would you say? That's 20, 30% of the time. That's already a huge improvement. So this is what he did. He made a few simple changes because he was exercising. He was already trying to eat a better quality food. He ate an earlier dinner. So he pulled that evening meal back a little bit more. He had to bring his carbs down. He had to have fewer carbohydrates total per meal. And he started his meal with protein and vegetables, very similar to the first fellow. And these are his numbers 4 weeks later. Look at this. In range. In range. Fasting glucose is normal again. In 4 weeks, he dropped a dose of his glipizide, one of his medications he was on. He dropped 1 blood pressure medication. He was on 2 different blood pressure medications, so he could drop 1 of those. And for those of you who are on blood pressure medications, some of those are actually diuretics. And you don't just take the blood pressure medication, you also take a gigantic potassium pill that goes with it. That thiazide diuretic often will also raise your blood sugar. So it's really helpful to get off that one. Don't just stop taking it, but to start talking to your doctor and seeing how you can control your blood sugar in other ways. But he got off of that one and he felt so much more in control, avoided going on insulin. And I can tell you that this person then started exercising more, feeling better. And this just gave him a whole new lease on life. And what I learned from working with these people and with the hundreds of people that I've worked with is when you know what works for you, you can achieve more with less and it's sustainable. So I didn't have these guys, I didn't hand them a meal plan that was totally different from what they were already eating. I did not give them an intense exercise program. I didn't give them a handful of supplements. We looked at what was a problem and we found ways that we could tweak their lifestyle and their diet, little tweaks. And what were the little tweaks that made the biggest difference? Because if you're doing less and getting more, you're more likely to keep doing it over the long term. And it doesn't matter what you do for the 4 weeks you're using a continuous glucose monitor. It matters what you're going to use, what you're going to do every day that year. That's what makes a big difference. So I want to leave you with a couple strategies today from this talk. I need to bring up that link to this handout. I want you to learn how to track your insulin, and I want you to learn how to track your blood sugar in real time. So one is I want to give you this resource guide. So you can see this. This is a little picture of it. Pro tips for smarter metabolic tracking. This is just a Google document that I've got, and it's going to give you the instructions on how to track your insulin, triglycerides, and a whole bunch of other metrics. It'll give you the reference ranges and how to do it. And that will give you an idea of how high or low your insulin is. Do you need to lower it? And if you do have insulin resistance, it gives you a way to track it so you can see if it's improving. So you can use your phone and scan this QR code and it'll take you to this, and you can download this for free. And when you get it, you can also see there's a link to my book, Hack Your Blood Sugar, because that gives you all of this and more. So I encourage you to check out my book. Like I said, it just came out on Amazon officially last week. It's been out for about a month now, but you have an official launch date, and that was last week. We've got this on paperback and on ebook, and this book does 3 things. It does 3 things for you. It was only going to do one thing, then I realized I had to do all 3. One is it a complete user manual for these continuous glucose monitors. These continuous glucose monitors are so useful, but I will tell you that the data can be really confusing. And I have met so many people who will start using this and they get mountains of data, but don't know what to do with it. And like I said, this isn't rocket science, but it does take a little learning. And this book lays it out how to use them. That's one. The second thing it does is it helps you interpret your data. You understand the data. And part of understanding the data is understanding all this insulin resistance, carbohydrate metabolism. So it explains that to you in a really clear way, and also gives you, these patient stories. I was talking about these 2 fellows. It walks you through in more detail other people's cases and their stories. So it helps you see these things through an actual human. The third thing it does is it describes 6 glucotypes. So back at the beginning when I said, it depends on what kind of prediabetes you have. If you have 3 people with the A1C of 6.2, it could be 3 different causes, 3 different situations. And type 2 diabetes is also very heterogeneous. And so what this book does is it gives you glucotypes. It helps you understand what your glucotype is. And this could be, do you have metabolic syndrome? Do you have just the beginnings of insulin resistance? Do you have the startings of beta cell dysfunction? Do you not produce enough insulin? Do you have type 2 diabetes with metabolic syndrome? Type 2 diabetes without metabolic syndrome? Until you identify which glucotype you're part of, you can't go to the next step. You've got to do that first, because once you know that, then you can go to the next step and figure out, okay, this is my glucotype. Now I can figure out what my root cause is. And when you figure out the root cause, then you can find the best solution. And when you find the best solutions, then you are doing less and getting better solutions, right? You get better results from the solutions. So I'm going to end here, and I hope this was helpful and you had a good look at the book, Hack Your Blood Sugar. Let me know if you're coming in with comments a little bit later. If you have more questions, I will answer them once we're offline. And maybe I will do this again. I'd be curious what questions you have after you read this book, or if you've been using a continuous glucose monitor, what are your questions using that? Or if you haven't used a continuous glucose monitor, maybe you want to know which one to use. So drop some of those questions in the chat and I will come back and answer those a little bit later. All right. Thanks so much for your attention and have a good one.